Hi, and welcome to my presentation on Renita Weems and Womanist Theology. And the reason I've entitled it this way is because we were supposed to do a report on a contextual theologian. And Renita Weems is an Older Testament scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar. And so technically she's not, her discipline is not theology. And so I wanted to make the connection in terms of contextual theology. So let's get started. Renita Weems was born in Atlanta, Georgia on June 26, 1954. She was born into a working class family, and family attended a storefront Pentecostal church in Atlanta, and she was active there. And through her participation at that church, she really found a love for biblical stories. When she was 12 years old, her mother abandoned the family, and this left her with a lot of anger. And one way she dealt with it was by reading. She really developed a passion for reading in her teenage years. She also had the help of a mentor, Mrs. Doane, who was one of her high school teachers at Booker T. Washington High School. And Ms. Doane helped her with her anger. And the way I like to think about it is if Ms. Doane had not intervened, we may not have Renita Weems, the scholar, today. So she graduated from Booker T. Washington High School in 1972. So she really came of age right at the point the Black Power movement was kind of on its descent. And she talks about how she was part of a group of talented African American students who were invited to attend elite universities. So she and 50 other black women were in the first year class at Wellesley College. And while she was there at Wellesley, she started attending an African Methodist Episcopal church in the Boston area. And after she graduated from Wellesley in 1976, she got a job on Wall Street, had a couple of different jobs, but after 2 years, quit to pursue writing full time. She felt writing was really her passion. But during that time, she started having these theological stirrings, kind of going back to her childhood, that love for biblical stories. So she decided to pursue a Master's of Divinity at Princeton Seminary. And because she had started attending the Methodist Church in Boston, she decided to also pursue ordination in the AME Church. And she was ordained in 1979. And she says that it was really difficult at that time for women in ministry, that women really didn't get good assignments. They would get a charge that had very few members, or the congregation was very dysfunctional. And so she decided that her vocation would be the academy. And so she pursued a PhD in Older Testament Studies at Princeton and finished in 1989. And with her completion, she became the first African American woman to get a PhD in Old Testament studies. She became an assistant professor at Vanderbilt Divinity School in 1987, so she started before she had actually finished her PhD. And she was at Vanderbilt for 16 years. She was promoted to associate professor in 1996. And then in 2003, she became the inaugural William and Camille Cosby Endowed Professor in the Humanities at Spelman College from 2003 to 2005. And currently she serves as the Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs of American Baptist College in Nashville. And she's been doing that since 2010. And just in case you don't know, recognize the name American Baptist College. It's a small liberal arts school, and it's the school that a number of the ministers who were active in the civil rights movement, the Nashville movement, attended. So this is where Congressman John Lewis was a student, and C.T. Vivian and James Bevel were also leaders in SNCC. So Dr. Weems is quite a prolific writer. She has a number of academic publications, but she's also written for more popular press. So Ebony Magazine, Essence Magazine, Ms., the New York Times Book Review, Christian Century. And in 2007, she actually started a blog called Something Within. It was somethingwithin.com. And she said it was for thinking women of faith. And thinking women of faith is one of her kind of favorite phrases. Whenever she speaks, she uses that term. In terms of her actual books, her first one was in 1988, Just a Sister Away. It's a collection of stories using her imagination around women characters in the Bible. And this particular book, even though it's really not a scholarly monograph, it is used in undergraduate and graduate courses throughout the country. Carolyn Pressler at United uses it in the Orientation to Older Testament class. And in looking on the web, a number of colleges and universities use it for biblical studies, women's studies, Africana studies, and gender study classes, and also, of course, churches and women's groups use it for Bible studies and for retreats. After that publication, she wrote I Ask for Intimacy, which is also a collection of essays. Some of them are more personal, and others contain stories about biblical characters again. So once again, using that Older Testament, that biblical interpretation training in writing these books. Her first scholarly monograph was Battered Love, and that was in 1995, where she looks at marriage, sex, and violence in the Hebrew prophets. That was followed by a spiritual memoir in 1999, Listening for God. And in it, she talks about how she experienced a spiritual crisis where she really felt like she was not hearing from God. And in it, she reveals, a lot about her life. And it actually won a communication award. The next book was Showing Mary, and it is focused on Mary, the mother of Jesus, and from her story, she gives lessons for women on really developing intergenerational intergenerational relationships with other women, in terms of how to establish and sustain mentoring relationships. And in my mind, this certainly comes out of her own need to have women in her life, older women in her life, because her mother abandoned her. The next book in 2004 was What Matters Most, and this is based on her scholarship on the Song of Songs, and focusing on the Shulamite woman that's featured in the Song of Songs, the main character, or the main woman character in the Song of Songs. She gleans 10 lessons in how to live passionately. So in discussing all of these, there's nothing in particular that that uses a womanist methodology per se, or exclusively focuses on Black women, but she does use feminist, womanist, biblical criticism, and African American oral tradition in her work. Just a Sister Away actually was revised in 2007. She added a couple more stories, and with that volume, she no longer had the womanist vision of women's relationships in the Bible. She had a different subtitle, and she doesn't explain why she used that, but I imagine it was for it to have a broader appeal. In terms of more academic work, she really has focused on Song of Songs. In the second edition, the 1998 edition of the Women's Bible Commentary, she wrote the chapter on Song of Songs, and she also wrote the chapter on Song of Songs for the New Interpreter's Bible. And they're very similar, and along with What Matters Most, one of the things that I got from them, for me, that's important personally, is the fact that Song of Songs 1:5, which begins, I am Black and beautiful, she talks about how that conjunction in, I can't remember if it's Hebrew or Aramaic, it can be but or and. So it's up to the translator to decide whether they say, I am Black and beautiful, or I am Black but beautiful. And so I actually use it as a screening criteria for Bible translations. I go to Song of Songs 1:5, and if the translator has decided to use the and, I am okay with that translation, but if they have the but, I go somewhere else. I don't use it. So I do think that is something for me that's important, but not necessarily in and of itself a womanist technique. But I think bringing it out and understanding the importance that would have for people whose skin has been kissed by the sun, I think that is a womanist approach. Now, in terms of Dr. Weems' preaching, she's been recognized by Ebony Magazine a couple of times, once as one of the 15 greatest Black women preachers, and then in an Ebony poll, she was listed as the 4th best Black female preacher. And so she was ordained in 70, 9. And in talking about her experience, she really does credit Reverend Jeremiah Wright, pastor emeritus of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, for giving young women ministers like her numerous opportunities to preach. Many men wouldn't invite women to preach, or they wouldn't allow them to actually get in the pulpit. They would have to preach from the floor, and he didn't do any of that. He really did his best to promote women ministers, and especially Dr. Weems. And the way he describes her preaching is that she combines the scholarship of a PhD in Old Testament and Hebrew languages with the Deep South's wisdom of Black women who have known hard times. And I think that's what really resonated with me. I couldn't tell at first when I first heard her, but it was that resonance of my Southern Black Baptist background, and then also kind of her technique of recovering the story of overlooked women biblical characters, which is something she does quite a bit. In terms of her preaching, Ebony praised her for her ability to make scripture come alive to town and gown, and for her profound understanding of the pain, suffering, aspirations, and hopes of African American women. And so there I would definitely say that that's a womanist technique, because it's very much based on the lived experience of Black women. And so that's what she does in her preaching. So what I wanted to do was to next talk about womanist theology in general, so you can kind of see where she fits in there. So the term womanist comes from Alice Walker, and the definition has 4 parts. It's from womanish, which is a Black cultural expression that is opposite of girlish, not frivolous, irresponsible, not serious. It means that you are responsible, in charge, serious. And Stacey Floyd Thomas calls this part of the definition as radical subjectivity. Then with the second part of the definition, I'm not going to read it all, I'll just lift up a couple of things. This is said to encompass traditional communalism within the Black community. And this is the part of the definition that has caused some controversy among scholars, Black women scholars. It starts off, a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually. And so for some women scholars who are not supportive of same-sex, same gender-loving relationships, this is not an appropriate moniker because they don't see it as being Christian. Another thing I wanted to point out is committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female, not separatists except periodically for health. So there is that connection to the whole community, but understanding also that there may be times you need to isolate yourself and take care of yourself. And that commitment to people is not limited to Black people, it's to all people, and it's not limited to just women, it's men and women. Third part, loves music, loves dance, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love and food and roundness, loves struggle, loves the folk, loves herself regardless. And this is described as the redemptive self-love part of the definition. And the last part is womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. And this is considered as the critical engagement piece. And the way I think about it is that it acknowledges that womanists and feminists are related, but there is a difference. And some people talk about it as it's a sister relationship, others talk about it being a cousin relationship. And I say that because there are some womanists who are have very strong opinions that you do not subsume womanist under feminism, that it should have its, its own silo per se. And so in terms of how womanist theology got started, really I identified the birthplace at Union Theological Seminary. And there were two professors, James Cone, who we just finished reading, father of Black theology, and Beverly Harrison, a feminist theologian. And they had all these Black women students in the late 70s and 80s who, when they heard their professor talk about Black liberation theology, that it really didn't include women or address women. And then within feminist theology, it talked about white women, but it didn't really address Black women. And these scholars talk about also the real hostility they encountered in seminary within the African American community from Black men who really didn't think they should be ministers and sometimes would not let them be part of African American gatherings. So then it's not a surprise that in 1983, when Alice Walker's book comes out, that they're really drawn to this definition. And Jacqueline Grant talks about how it just kind of spread like popcorn. Union is in New York and not that far away from Princeton. Renita Weems had relationships with students at Union. And so, there's kind of this cross-pollination going on in terms of their work. And they actually started a womanist consultation and a womanist group within the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature to bring Black women together to talk about the research and really this new theology that they were creating. Now, the initial articles that are considered pioneering works in womanist theology. The first was Jacqueline Grant's Black Theology and the Black Woman, which was written in 1979. And what these scholars always included in these initial writings and from that point forward was they didn't use the language of intersection, but they would talk about triple oppression of race, class, and gender. So there was always this concern for how class would affect women, and then not always, it was not always expressly said, but other oppressions, so like sexual orientation and disability. In 1985, Katie Cannon wrote The Emergence of Black Feminist Consciousness, and in 1987, Dolores Williams was the first person to publish a work with the name Womanist in it. In terms of the actual monographs, book-length texts that were written with Womanist in it. The first was Katie Cannon with Black Womanist Ethics in 1988. In that same year, Renita Weems, Just a Sister Away, A Womanist Vision of Women's Relationships. Jacqueline Grant, White Women's Christ, Black Women's Jesus, and Dolores Williams, Sister in the Wilderness in 1991. Now, in thinking about this, that Renita Weems was, or is, a biblical scholar, what the author of Womanist Biblical Interpretation says is that Weems very clearly describes herself as a womanist scholar, and sometimes she will refer to her work as womanist, but most of the time she doesn't. But when she does describe it as womanist, there's not a particular method. And so within biblical studies, that coming up with a method is something that is still developing. But within ethics, there's definitely a method that has been described, and there's actually a book that Stacey Ford Thomas has written with the method that she says anyone can use, so it's not limited to Black women. And also within Womanist Theology, there are particular goals that, again, I would say aren't limited to use by Black women only. And so the first goal of Womanist Theology, and I'm using those goals that have been outlined by Linda Thomas, who's anthropologist of religion at Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. And the first one, she says, is honoring, lifting up, using Black women's voice and experience. So she might begin a class with a picture of Sojourner Truth at the front table and a reading by Truth, or preaching based on the words and activism of Harriet Tubman. The second is decolonizing internalized oppression. So being very cognizant of the impact of white supremacy on people of African descent and also other colonized, oppressed people, and really addressing that. Understanding that women can be patriarchal too. And last is encouraging conversation and praxis between the academy, church, and community. And that is always important, and to me that goes back to that communalism part of the womanist definition, is that the scholarship has some meaning and relationship to what's happening in the church and the community, that you keep these ties open. And I remember Katie Cannon saying once that one of her professors told her that she shouldn't be involved in the church, she should just let it go, that on Sunday she should be reading the New York Times and preparing her lessons for the next week. In terms of the task of womanist theology, one is retrieval, and that's the idea of really digging into those overlooked stories of women, really acknowledging unnamed women within biblical stories, within U.S. history, within global history. The second is critical reevaluative. So really looking at existent theology and deconstructing it. What is it that we no longer think will work, and what is it that will work? And taking those things they think will work, and three, constructing something new. So you can't just tear down what's there and critique it. You've also got to come up with an alternative. The fourth part is confessional, and that is that women have to be upfront about their shortcomings and really have integrity within the relationships, but also that womanist is a term that has to be claimed by the individual. It's not something that's imposed on someone else. So, for instance, I wouldn't say Harriet Tubman was a womanist. It didn't exist then. Her actions, her behavior, her activism was certainly part of the history of Black women's activism, and is similar to what womanist activists are doing today, but we wouldn't use that terminology. And then lastly, community relational, the idea again that what you're doing is connected to the community and has value for the community. So that's my brief overview. I just wanted to do a few more biographical highlights. So Dr. Weems is married to Reverend Martin Espinoza, and they co-pastor the Ray of Hope Community Church in Nashville. And one time when I heard her preach, he was there, she introduced him, and she talked about how, some people were like, oh, I have to see this person. And she said, I didn't know how to take that. It was like, whether they thought I couldn't get a husband, or, what kind of man was this that was marrying her. And she talked about how he is a friend of her mind, and that, he really demonstrated his love for her in so many ways. And she talked about how when her father was ill and staying with them, he would carry him up the stairs and give him a bath. So just a really great relationship. They've been married over 25 years. And they have a daughter, Savannah Nia, who graduated from Spelman last year. These are pictures from left to right with some students at American Baptist College, and then the one up top is Dr. Weems in a fabric store. She has a real love of fabric, and she says she has to have some kind of activity that really uses her right brain to, really use her creativity, so it doesn't atrophy with all the other kind of serious academic mental activity that she has going on. And I think this picture is of her daughter. I'm not sure. She is a rather private person. And so if it's not her daughter, it's one of the many young women that she has mentored, and is quite happy to be in this photo with. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you is that if you wanted to hear her preaching or her lectures, there are a number that are on YouTube, including a couple of lectures she gave at Yale, where she was the first African American female to give the Lyman Beecher Hicks lecture. There's also a mini documentary on womanism, What Manner of Woman Is This, that is also on YouTube. And I think it's about 12 or 13 minutes, so really short, but you get to see some of these women that I've talked about. And so that's it. Hope you have enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you.